So, as you know, over the last few weeks, I have been talking about the upcoming 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and I'm pretty critical of the document. I know many people love the idea of a Declaration of Independence, and they consider the signing of that declaration on the 4th of July in 1776 as America's birthday, United States birthday, I should say, not America. That's a misnomer. But and look, next week will be the 250th anniversary of the signing of that document, and people will be celebrating. Unfortunately, as I suggested last week, I don't think a whole lot of people have read the thing, and that's unfortunate because I think it's important that people understand what the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Declaration of Independence, was, because it may not be all that it is hyped up to be. I mean, I've heard some people suggest it's one of the greatest pieces of work that was ever ever penned, and it's basically a list of complaints that the colonies were having against the King of England. Some legit, some questionable. But ironically, almost every complaint that was lodged against the King of England, the United States, the colonies themselves, are guilty of almost every one of those charges they've laid. And in many ways, they've gone well beyond that. Have become much bigger tyrants globally than the UK could ever have imagined themselves to be. So I think it's important that people read it and then question what you're reading. I mean, as you're looking at what Thomas Jefferson filed as these facts submitted to a candid world, I think it's important that people realize they aren't facts necessarily; they are charges, and and what's missing in the Declaration of Independence is the independence part. I mean, what did the colonies intend to do other than file their complaints to the world about the King of England? What were their intentions? Why did they believe that they were entitled? I mean, other than making comments or about the rights under God or something like that. But what was their independence going to look like? I mean, they didn't really have a governing structure yet. They hadn't penned the Articles of Confederation or the Constitution, and they didn't make the case as to why they deserved to be independent and what that would look like. And look, I've read some of this last week. I read the charges, the 28 charges they filed against the King of England, but let me just read the kind of the preamble or the beginning again, because I think it's worth noting that there's a level of hypocrisy involved. It says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Again, you got to throw a little God in there. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and this is the part that you can't. I mean, you just got to listen to the words here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Well, were they? Were all men created equal? As far as the colonists were concerned, because they were were fully engaged in slavery and had been under British rule. So there seemed to be a big question about who was entitled to, be equal. That they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Well, if they're unalienable, then how was the United States and again their predecessors able to alienate such people, including Native people? And I've got to add certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, there wasn't a whole lot of liberty amongst the enslaved, those people who were kidnapped from and shipped from Africa, and life was not necessarily being respected amongst the native people, who were being murdered and exterminated. Everything from scalp bounties to massacres, including during the Revolutionary War. So I don't know that these colonies were really respecting this idea of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, except for their own. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, again, who consented to this? I mean, certainly those descendants of Africa, those who were brought in from, as slaves, didn't consent to their circumstance. So there was no consent of the governed amongst that population. And the people who were here before the Europeans showed up, we never consented to any of this stuff. And ultimately, they would try to impose their citizenship on the those of African descent. Or they would try to do it to the native Hawaiian people, and they would do it to native people. They would impose it. They wouldn't offer it. Citizenship and what they claimed to be freedom. It wasn't offered. It was again declared. So you have to question this idea of consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such a form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Well, I think that Native people have that right too. I would have thought that the formerly enslaved and those who were dragged in from and kidnapped and chained and put into bondage from Africa, I think they were entitled to that same thing. But that's not mentioned in this again in this hypocritical document. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Well, on that one I'll agree, because Native people are just as guilty as anybody else to take what is again suffer what is sufferable, and that's kind of where we find ourselves at today. So I wanted to read that because there is such hypocrisy involved in some of this language, but that's not what I'm really going to concentrate on this show today. On this show today, as much as I want to reference not just that the Declaration of Independence of the United States doesn't really detail why they're entitled to independence or talk about what that independence is going to look like. It really just lodges its complaint against the King of England. And for all intents and purposes, this is as much a declaration of war as it is a Declaration of Independence. There's not a whole lot in here that talks about independence. It just talks about the tyranny of the king, a tyranny that the colonists themselves were guilty of, even as colonies, but certainly would be further guilty of as the United States for 250 years. So I think it's really important that people realize the hypocrisy of the language of this. But if you don't read it, if you've never read it, if you've never really read and thought about it, and I had to remind people that of the complaints, the final one is where we're mentioned. And as I've mentioned several times over the years, we are singled out. As Native people, we are singled out in both the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, the amendments to the Constitution, and even in the Declaration of Independence. We are the only ones that are singled out. And we are singled out by Thomas Jefferson in the final complaint against the king. And what he says here is that he has excited domestic insurrection among us. In other words, he's caused tension amongst the colonies and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, and that would be us. And if you're watching this program, you see that I've got, once again, have a Merciless Indian Savage t-shirt on. The merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And that one really sticks with me, because when I think about what the United States has done to Native people in particular, but certainly to those of African descent, and then globally, when I think about the destruction of all ages, what did they say again? All ages, sexes, and conditions. I just got to say it again. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on a much smaller country that was already been knocked to its knees by one of the largest aerial assaults ever 6 months prior. And they dropped two atomic bombs on civilian population. That's men, old men, women, children, and would wreak such havoc on. They had no idea what the total destruction would look like. But these atomic bombs, and it's the only time in U.S. in the world history that a country has done something this with this level of atrocity. And then and for the United States now to seem like that they are the the arbiter of what is right and wrong when it comes to nuclear weapons is almost absurd by the very facts of history. So when I hear a charge being laid that the King of England was soliciting our help as Native people, and that we have this this ruthless uh, code of warfare that is the destruction of all sexes, ages, and conditions. Look, that's not just a pot calling a kettle black. That's the United States, which would be the guiltiest country across the entire planet for the death and destruction of men, women, and children, and not just as a country, as a people. I mean, we still suffer from what we call missing and murdered indigenous women, and of course that includes girls and children, LGTB. But this idea that the American public could have embedded within them a rape culture and an abuse culture that is so deep and so historic that it still sustains itself today. And look, I know there's laws against the very crimes that are committed against Native women, but it doesn't stop the American public from perpetrating those crimes. Native women are 5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than anybody else on the planet. Than anybody. Well, anybody else in the United States, put it that way. I know there are other places where women are very much persecuted. But that's the circumstance. That's what we experience. So again, I can't get past some of the languages of this. But here's what I want to do today. Today I want to talk about an alternative. Because we as Native people, we as Haudenosaunee, we have our own way of declaring and have had our own way of declaring our independence. And while I'm somewhat hesitant to use certain expressions that are widely accepted as, in the American lexicon, like constitution and laws and courts and that kind of stuff. Some actually do apply. I don't necessarily call our Guyana or Goa what people call the Great Law of Peace. I don't call that our Constitution. I don't think the word Constitution rightly applies. But what I will say is we have a thing called the Deohade, or the Two Row Wampum. And I think it does qualify as being promoted as our Declaration of Independence. And it's not a declaration of war. It's not facts submitted to a candid world about tyranny. It is really about peaceful coexistence. That's what we put together in the Two Row Wampum. It's more than complaints and accusations made in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. It's not a call for war. It's just the opposite. It's a call for peace. It's about peaceful coexistence. So let me explain a little bit about what the Deohade or Two Row Wampum is, because there's some confusion over it. There's some confusion about where it originates even. I mean, there are many, and I've oftentimes I don't try to confront necessarily or become too argumentative, but many people would suggest that the Two Row Wampum begins with an agreement with the Dutch, and somewhere between the early 1600s, some dates suggest 1613 or wherever else, with the Dutch. And it's described as, again, just so you know what the Two Row Wampum looks like, it is basically a belt of primarily white wampum shells with 2 rows that extend across the entire belt. It looks like 2 parallel lines, on two parallel purple lines of wampum on a bed of white wampum. That's what it looks like as a belt. And what those 2 rows represent, and we'll debate a little bit about what they really meant, but what many people believe it symbolizes is the ship of the Europeans and the canoe of native people on the river of life, and the ship and the canoe will not interfere with the path of the other vessel. So it's two vessels on water, traveling side by side, separate though, and not interfering with each other, not overtaking the other path or the other route. I mean, that's why they are essentially parallel paths. That's the way the belt is represented. But there's a reason why this has become analogized to two ships or two vessels on water. It's because Europeans didn't have a path here. See, originally, the Deohade, or sometimes called the Degani Deohade, two paths, two rows, um, represented paths across our motherland. And those paths represented the distinction of not just other peoples that are coexisting on our lands or on the lands that we share, but even other parts of creation. So it's about mutual respect, respecting that yes, we are on a path and we don't expect to be encumbered by anybody else, nor should we be encumbering the deep paths by other parts of creation and certainly other peoples. I mean, these were offered to other native peoples, especially in the East out here. This was about what our Haudenosaunee diplomacy was all about. It was about peaceful coexistence. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't tensions and that sometimes those tensions didn't percolate, especially when Europeans got involved and they tried to instigate problems amongst native peoples. But for the most part, this is how our people maintained diplomacy. We talked about sharing the same lands and each of us respecting the past. So when I talk about this being our Declaration of Independence, it's not just about our independence, it's about respecting the independence of others. Again, not a declaration of war, not a list of charges against what we think is an enemy or an adversary. It isn't even about adversaries, it's about peaceful coexistence. So, but when Europeans showed up, they didn't have a path here. I mean, and when I talk about our paths, I mean paths that were worn by millions of feet that came before us. Our ancestors. Our ancestors had managed a way of life on these lands, and that path was worn deep, and that path moved with nature. I mean, it wasn't. We didn't carve up up the landscape to create a path. But we respected that there were other paths and other people had different ways of operating and that they had different cultures, they had different languages, they had different belief systems. They have different means of survival and sustaining themselves. We understood all that. So so that's why we created this two row, this Deohade, and we extended it to other days. And this is a matter of fact. This isn't just opinion. We've seen other cultures that have the similar designs in their belts. Some that we exchanged those belts with. But when the Europeans came, and we could argue that it was the Dutch first, we offered this Deohade, this two row wampum to them, and we explained that you don't have a path here, but you travel in a vessel, and we travel in canoes, and that we shouldn't overtake each other. So we changed the analogy to two vessels on the water, and we described that water as the river of life, and that's what we did. That's what we offered. And interestingly enough, several decades ago, I had the opportunity to meet with a guy who was from the Netherlands. His job was to interpret and draft what was the tax code for the Dutch, and including what trade and commerce looked like, international trade. And he was really excited to meet both myself and my friend Degarundage, because he says when they research their databases in the Netherlands, it begins, as far as the United States goes, or America, he says it begins with the Two Row Wampum. And that's what he told us. I mean, weren't spoon feeding this to him. This is what he says. He goes, I realize that historically, our relationship with this continent begins with you. It begins with that Two Row Wampum, that Deohade. And he says it's on that we've built our relationship with whomever we were dealing with on in this continent. And that's so that was I found that very interesting. And nobody's ever come from another European country to suggest the significance of that, of that agreement. But France accepted it, Great Britain, the UK accepted it, and the Americans accepted it. And they understood what we were saying with this Deohade, with this Two Row Wampum. And the reason I say that it's appropriate to refer to this as our Declaration of Independence is because it really does talk about the coexistence, the independent coexistence of our path and whoever is placed on another path. I mean, look, we call it two rows, but but anybody could represent that other path. We're one of them, and the other one. And what separates them, we in the belts, we have 3 rows of white wampum that separates the 2 rows of purple wampum, and we say that those paths are separated by peace, power, and righteousness. That's what we say. We say that it'll always be about maintaining peace first, the power of the good mind, and the power, and so not just might and physical power, not just aggression, but the power to do good, and of course righteousness, meaning just that, the intent to do what is right. Those are what those 3 white wampum shells between the 2 rows represent. And this is who we were. So unlike the U.S. Declaration on the Rights of Declaration, of Independence, which is really about aggression, it's really about trying to spell out the tyranny of the monarchy. And keep in mind, much of what they were challenging in with the King of England was it was a monarchy. It wasn't a democracy. That's not what they lived under. That's not what these people were. And look, I'm not arguing they didn't have a right to push back. But again, I can't escape the irony of the fact that the colonies would ultimately be guilty of everything that they charged the King of England with. Everything. And in many cases, far worse, especially when you look as history would continue. And the ability to make war and the ability to kill and oppress would become even more extreme. Look, the colonies were built on enslaved Africans, chattel slavery, and the theft of native lands. For all anybody wants to talk about this great experiment in democracy, that's not what the United States was successful for. It was successful for breaking every bit of the creed that they and the things that they complained about in the Declaration of Independence and the stuff that they put in their Articles of Confederation and U.S. Constitution. There's no denying the level of guilt and tyranny that the United States would represent in these 250 years, and nor is there any denying what their predecessors were guilty of. The mass murders. Look, I think today is actually the 150th anniversary of what they call the Battle of Little Bighorn, or the Battle of Greasy Grass. This is we've had conflicts almost on a continuous basis. The United States has, and the thing is, and part of the reason that I've battled so hard against, like the mascot issue, for instance, is as white folks used us for the mascots, they always wanted to portray us as violent, as warriors, as if that was our only function, was to commit war. And in fact, every time we hear about Native people enlisting at a high rate into the U.S. military, it's because it's in their DNA. They have it's the warrior complex that they have, that they must fulfill. No, we're not, somehow predisposed to be warlike. The Haudenosaunee, we are people of peace. That's, they translate our Guyana to go to say the Great Law of Peace. It doesn't necessarily translate to that, but that's what they say. We were people of peace. Now, I'm not saying that we didn't have conflicts, and in fact, what people refer to as the formation of the Haudenosaunee, which was really only a reunification, it came after a period of time that there was infighting. And we did have conflicts with other Native people. But we didn't commit genocide amongst each other or with anybody else. Yes, there was conflict, and there were instances where people were absorbed into other confederacies, for lack of a better word, or unions. And here's the other thing that I have to continuously refute: this idea that the United States and the founding fathers modeled their independence and their governing system after us. They didn't. No, they didn't. Look, they were envious. Make no mistake about it. They were envious of the fact that we were able to create a union of 5 nations and later 6 that would seem undissolvable. That's what Ben Franklin called it. He goes, how is it that 5 nations of ignorant savages could create a union that seems so sustainable and undissolvable? That's what Franklin referred to us as, ignorant savages who were able to sustain a union when these Englishmen, and this was even before the Revolutionary War. This was when he was saying that the colonies themselves should form a pact as colonies rather than having it imposed by the British Parliament. So he used us as an example, both either sarcastically or condescendingly, but mostly to shame his Englishman brothers into really putting aside their egos to form a union and to have a governing system for the colonies. It ultimately would lead to them wanting to declare their independence. But again, I can't emphasize enough that if you read the Declaration of Independence, there's not a whole lot in there about being independent. It's mostly about making their charges and their accusations against the King of England for the tyranny, the same tyranny that they would continue, and not just them. Europeans generally were among the most oppressive people on the planet, and the colonization obviously wasn't just here in the Western Hemisphere or North America. It was South America. It was Africa. It was Australia. It was all parts of Asia. And the UK was a dominant part of it, but they weren't alone. There was Spain and Portugal and France and Italy. There were all of these these other countries of Europe who were staking claims and establishing colonies. I mean, people sometimes forget. In our film, The Long Hope, we talk about the Tehitan case, and this case that was ruled by the same court that could acknowledge racism in Brown versus the Board of Education. But that same court, when the Tlingit of the Tehitan people would argue that they were having their forests wiped out, they were having their resources stolen, they were being pushed off of their lands, and the same court that could recognize racism in education used some of the most racist legal doctrines in the history of the United States, and I've talked about those at length here, to suggest that the Tehitan, the Tlingit, had no real rights to their lands, that they really only had a right of occupancy, and that occupancy could be extinguished without compensation. Their resources could be taken without compensation. And I have to remind people that area was purchased from Russia. So Russia also was involved in trying to establish colonies in various places. We know about Denmark and Greenland, and we know that even some of the smaller, more obscure nations played a huge role in trying to take lands and resources from other peoples. So Russia, which really didn't even establish colonies to speak of on the lands that would be known as Alaska, they set up some outposts, and then they went and they sold it to the United States, because the Russian Empire was in dire straits themselves. So they sold it off using the so-called doctrine of Christian discovery to lay claim to land that was already fully inhabited by native peoples. And they sold it off to the United States, and then the United States would just pillage the lands. So I oftentimes have to remind people, especially as you read some of these things, these charges made in the Declaration of Independence, that you understand. And that's why I said last week, when you read it, just for a moment, as you're reading it, consider the view of Native people, or of Black people, or of Native Hawaiians. Consider what people the the pers- the perspective of non-white folks as you're reading this stuff, non-Europeans, non-British. I mean, I oftentimes have to remind people one of the other complaints in that they lodged against the king was the idea that he had was limiting immigration. Well, that's what the United States is all about, trying to limit immigration. See, the colonies, they wanted more population. And frankly, the United States is facing a bit of a population downturn, and it's becoming problematic. So, but at the time, they're saying, oh, the King of England wasn't allowing them to populate the colonies. And of course, in that same complaint about the King of England limiting immigration or stopping immigration for to bolster the population of these colonies, they also mentioned that the appropriations of lands was being interfered with, which meant the taking of native lands. So we're essentially loosely mentioned twice in the Declaration of Independence. One, when it comes to this notion of appropriation of new lands, because they aren't new lands, they weren't new to us. And of course, being referred to as merciless Indian savages. So I just think that it's important that people realize that there is a different way to assert independence than declaring war. Now, I realize that the European, I guess, nature was to always have these breakaway colonies have to fight for them. But, I also have to remind people that when the United States got involved in the so-called Spanish American Wars, and they were taking lands in the South Pacific from Spain, they were waging war against places like the Philippines. And they argued that that American soldiers, and again, this is at the turn of the century, the 19th century, that the Americans, for the first time, were waging war against the people fighting for their independence. Well, that's not true. That was in a book called True Flag, I think, by Stephen Kinzer or something along those lines. And that's what he suggested in his book. Well, what the hell did you think we were fighting for? We were fighting for our independence. We were fighting for our right to exist. But it's like when the United States got involved in places like the Philippines, all of a sudden somebody could see it for the first time and ignore what the United States not only had done to Native people, but would ultimately do to Hawaii and other places. Just take for the sake of taking. So no, I mean, again, when you look throughout U.S. history, it is mired not only in violence and conflict. I mean, I think there's only about, by some estimates, only about 40 or 50 years of the entire existence of the United States was there not some conflict, military conflict, either with Native people or with other countries or whatever else. And it might be closer to 20 years because it was like from conflict to conflict to conflict. That's what the United States was always involved. And ultimately, running down a path to declare themselves and to have others bow down to them as a superpower. And arguably, they want to maintain that they are the world's only superpower. Well, I don't know that that's necessarily true. Maybe from a military standpoint, in terms of defense spending and weaponry and that kind of stuff, but power isn't just about the ability to kill. Power is the ability to influence. And we've seen the United States fail miserably in its war against Iran. We've seen them, butt up against Russia and China, and not always have done very well. And of course, you've got a guy like Trump, the art of the deal guy, who seems to kiss ass to more of these world leaders, especially the more tyrannical ones, than really stand up to them. So I think it's, again, next week, at the very end, next Saturday, not this Saturday, next Saturday is the 4th of July. And this country, the United States, And frankly, other countries will be acknowledging this 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The saddest part is who's going to take the time to read it? I mean, who's going to really understand what was at stake and and then follow that path forward? So what did it mean? Because look, I got to be clear here. Native people got pulled into this conflict between the UK and the colonies. And part of it had to do with the fact that we had existing treaties with the with England, especially the Haudenosaunee. We had treaties with England. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was not a treaty, but it was the UK basically saying, "Look, we're going to respect where you are located, and we're no longer going to infringe on your territories." And that did nothing but manage to piss off the colonies. That's part of the reason that they were fighting for their independence. They wanted to take our lands. And I'm not saying the UK wasn't intent on doing that as well. I mean, they obviously their remaining colony, Canada, would do much of that. But I think it's to understand how we got pulled in. And here's the other thing, this myth I got to break. They oftentimes say, well, the Mohawk Nation fought with this side and the Oneida Nation fought. No, no. There was never a full declaration by any of the Six Nations to fight on one side or the other. There were people. There were Native people, some Oneidas, some Mohawks, and that fought on various sides. Part of it had to do with relationships, their personal relationships. Sometimes they were families that that had intermingled and that kind of stuff. So when we hear people say, "Well, the Six Nations, was involved and divided by the Revolutionary War," that's a broad brush stroke. And oftentimes you have to understand that Native people, like any other peoples, oftentimes get pulled in as almost as mercenaries. And part of it has to do with how do you exist in a world that seems to be at war. I mean, you can't always avoid it. And so part of the decision on which side to fight on was based on the conflict as it presented itself. And it wasn't, the Six Nations never declared war or declared themselves involved in the War of Independence for the colonies. I'm not saying that Native people weren't involved, and we certainly were targeted. I mean, George Washington himself in the Sullivan campaign, basically for the first time, called upon the use of terrorism. He said, "Let them know the terror of their chastisement." That's what George Washington said. And he told them, don't accept any pleas for peace. They need to know. He wanted to inflict intergenerational trauma. He wanted to destroy our food. He wanted to destroy every bit of our lives. That's what George Washington wanted to do, especially to the Cayugas and the Senecas. And that's what the Sullivan campaign was primarily about. So, you have to understand the complications, the complicated nature of that time period to fully understand what Native people were enduring. But again, that's not the way we pursued independence. We pursued it through what we call the Deahade, or Degani Deahade, or Two Row Wampum. We wanted to appreciate and respect that anybody had a right to exist. I mean, that's the whole nature of really respecting creation, is understanding that if creation made you, then creation made you with the intent that you had the right to live. That we had this this right to carry ourselves, and not necessarily the right to wage war. Look, there are all kinds of rules that frankly, European powers and and other people in the international community have created for what is lawful war versus unlawful war. But I don't know. Nobody's ever really enforced anything against the United States. The United States has never. I mean, even the idea of the United States ultimately declaring that we were U.S. citizens. Europe had already decided 10 years earlier that that was a war crime. They called it denationalization. The idea of stripping away somebody's national character and imposing another nation's character upon them. But nobody ever held the United States accountable. The United States, again, dropped 2 atomic bombs on a small island country. They were never held accountable. I'm not saying that the United States didn't, spend a bunch of money, just like they're spending a bunch of money to repair the destruction that they've caused in Iran. But part of it is that you're causing the destruction in the first place. You're causing the death and destruction of men, women, children, old men, infirmed. On day one of the United States attacking Iran, they killed 170 schoolgirls because they bombed a school. And you got the gall to say that merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Well, who the hell are you calling merciless savages? I just can't get past this. So today I wanted to talk about how we talk about independence. And that when we talk about independence, we talk about peaceful coexistence. Not about fighting for independence, but how to negotiate for independence. That's what we did. I know a lot of times people can even misinterpret. One of the things that we talk about with the two row is that we keep our ways on our path. And when we ultimately describe this as two vessels, we say, no, you keep your stuff in your ship and we'll keep our stuff in our canoe. And we won't try to ride with a foot in each vessel. That's another part of the analogy, right? But originally, we just respected that the path that we were on. Look, we can alter our paths, but not to overtake another. That was the whole point. But even as we described two vessels on the river of life, we acknowledged in those conversations that, look, we're going to be on the same water. And that water can become rough. And we might help each other. We might assist each other, but we're not going to overtake each other. As we experience rough waters and drought and weather and any number of other things that can befall a region, if we're in that region together, we're going to be battling the same things. We might have medicines for you. You might have things that we need, but we're not going to allow you to overtake our vessel, and we're not going to attempt to overtake yours. And ironically, when I think about the Europeans, and that again, this destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. One of the things that is widely known today, although rarely talked about, is the fact that Lord Jeffrey Amherst, he actually promoted the giving of diseased blankets to my people, to the Haudenosaunee, to the people in the East here. He knew that these were infected blankets. So they offer them to us, and we think they're trying to be kind. And it was literally the first use of germ warfare that the world would ever experience. I don't know of any other case. Maybe it happened elsewhere. Maybe that's where Amherst got the idea. But they handed out infected blankets that would kill our people, that would maim our people. And they did so in a manner that did not suggest that we were enemies. It seemed like a friendly gesture. Can you even imagine that? That's like sending somebody home with a bomb and they don't know they're carrying it. I'm not talking about a suicide bomber. I'm saying, okay, we're gonna offer you a gift. And look, and we've seen this over and over again. The grandfather of Pocahontas, or the father, I'm not sure which one, they invited them to dinner and they poisoned them. This is the kind of things that these Europeans were guilty of, the British and then ultimately the Americans. I don't think people can fully appreciate the level of treachery. See, everybody wants to talk about conquest, right? You're a conquered people. Well, again, your longer-serving Chief Justice of the Supreme Court suggested, however extravagant a pretension it is to convert discovery of an inhabited land to conquest may appear, If you can sustain it, then it becomes rule of law. That's essentially what he said. So if you tell a lie long enough, if you convince yourselves first that discovering a people is the same thing as conquering a people, and then even if those people don't know that they're being having this conquest waged against them, if you on your side of that ledger keep saying it and then document it and get the rest of your European brethren to accept that, that becomes rule of law, even though it's all unbeknownst to us. I mean, it's when anytime I confront somebody who says, "Well, you guys just have to accept you were conquered." Well, were we? I mean, the fact of the matter is, the United States, and I'm not even talking about its predecessors, but the United States itself, they were only involved in maybe 50 cited armed conflicts with Native people. 50. And there were 700 or 800, maybe as many as 1,000 distinct peoples. But with 50 conflicts, where the United States didn't even win them all, and then, of course, we get into this debate on what does it mean to win. Did the United States defeat Iran? I don't know. But we know they didn't defeat the Seminoles. They know that they lost battles. Again, today's the anniversary of Little Bighorn. So we know the United States didn't win them. Red Cloud, others had success against waging war against the United States. So out of those 50 conflicts, the United States didn't even win them all. But to suggest that we were conquered militarily, I think we were duped. I think fraud was committed. And unfortunately, what we experienced in all of this was such a change in our lifestyles that we became submissive and we accepted a certain amount of subjugation. Not all of us, and not completely. And that's why today you've got voices like mine who say, oh, hell no, I'm not a U.S. citizen. I refuse to accept being designated a U.S. citizen or declared a U.S. citizen. Ironically, a friend of mine just posted a form. He was taking on a job, and it was a government job. And he had to check boxes. And it said, are you a U.S. citizen? Are you a non-citizen U.S. national? Are you a lawful permanent resident? And I don't remember what the fourth choice was. I think it had to do with just being an immigrant, like with a green card or something. I don't know. But those boxes don't apply to us. Not necessarily. I mean, for me, I'm not a lawful permanent resident of the United States. I don't live in the United States. I live on Seneca territory. And I reject the idea of being a U.S. citizen. But I won't accept being called a U.S. national either. Because I don't think they get to dictate the labels they want to pin on us. But this is a form, and it's very clear. This is under the penalty of perjury. You've got to tell the truth. Well, how can we tell the truth when the four choices don't include a truthful answer? We still experience a level of erasure where we are almost expected to be complicit in that erasure. So this idea, are we U.S. citizens or aren't we? Well, look, I know the vast majority of Native people have accepted the imposition of U.S. citizenship. I know they have. But they may not always. And not all of us do. There are many of us who say, oh, hell no, you had no right to declare we were U.S. citizens. What were we before that? And what benefit do we have by becoming U.S. citizens, by accepting that declaration? What do we gain? Being taxed? Being regulated? Being governed without consent? Without any allegiance towards the United States? Without declaring any allegiance? We don't pledge allegiance. But you could just declare that we were your citizens, that we were yours? And at the same time, actually, even before you did that, you were already declaring that we were wards of the federal government. On what grounds? Only because we predate your existence? Look, and I know many of you listen to the show, and I say a lot of this stuff each week at some level. But knowing that we are going in to next week where the vast majority of Americans are going to be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, I say read the damn thing. Just read it. Read it and know that this goes well beyond the hypocrisy that guys like Donald Trump represent. We're talking about historically. Every president, including Barack Obama, who stood and sang the praises of the Homestead Act, where our lands were stolen from us, and declared that the Homestead Act was one of the most successful pieces of legislation in U.S. history. Yes, successful for you, because you basically, again, passed a law where you could steal our lands. And even even the Homestead Act and the allotment process was about forcing citizenship upon people. So there's much U.S. history that is never properly ferreted out. It's never properly talked about, and it's never framed within with a native perspective. That's why I am so pleased to be able to do this show. Resistance Radio is essentially my opportunity to offer a native perspective to issues that frankly affect us all. Look, you're all going to be celebrating, the 4th of July next week. And I asked the question within the same context as Frederick Douglass asked the question: what to the merciless Indian savage is the 4th of July? What to the merciless Indian savage is a Declaration of Independence? Look, I want to thank you for listening. I'm John Kane. This is Resistance Radio. Thank you, Yahweh.